Hello everyone. Tonight we're going to Ravensbrook, a quiet little place on the edge of the English moors where fog sits heavy and the air tastes faintly of coal dust. If you've never heard of Ravensbrook, that's not unusual. On maps, it's barely a dot. But lately, this forgotten town has been receiving some of the strangest, most unsettling mail in history. Blood red letters written in a shaky hand, each one hinting at a crime long buried. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, drop in the comments where you're watching from. You never know, someone in your own town might be curled up listening to this exact same mystery tonight. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The story begins in September of 1979 when the first envelope arrived. Mrs. Edith Halloway, an elderly widow who lived near the old railway station, found it tucked neatly between her gas bill and a farm supply catalogue. Unlike the rest, it wasn't printed or neatly typed. The envelope was stained, the ink smeared. Her name, Edith Halloway, was written in thick red script across the front. She assumed it was a prank, perhaps one of the neighborhood boys, but when she slit it open with a butter knife, she found a single sheet of paper covered in letters that looked almost scratched onto the page. The blood of Ravensbrook was never washed away. You know his name. You know what he did. That was all. No salutation, no signature. Edith rattled, folded the paper, and tucked it into her Bible. But the next day another letter was delivered, and this time it wasn't just her. Across town, the Cooper family received one too. Then the village schoolteacher. By the end of the week, 7 households had letters, each one slightly different, but all written in the same disturbing crimson ink. Some hinted at murder, others at betrayal. All of them circled back to the same theme: Ravensbrook was hiding a crime. Here's the part that chilled people the most. The ink didn't smudge when touched. A chemist from the neighbouring town of Brackenshire examined one of the envelopes and in hushed tones suggested it was written not with dye or paint but with blood. Whose blood he couldn't confirm. But the whisper spread. Someone is writing in their own blood. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the letters were an elaborate hoax or if the chemical tests were botched. But at the time, it was enough to ignite panic. Ravensbrook wasn't the sort of place that liked attention. Built around a coal mine in the 1800s, it had always been a town of shadows and secrets. The mine accident of 1922, when 14 men were trapped underground for 3 days, was still spoken of in lowered voices. Even in the 1970s, people remembered the smell of smoke that lingered for weeks. So when the blood letters appeared, the villagers fell back on old habits, silent suspicion, and looking over their shoulders. One of the strangest details came from the postmaster himself, a man named Colin Whitby. He swore hand on heart that none of the letters had been stamped. They had simply, appeared. I don't remember handling them, he told police. It's like they slipped into the bags when no one was looking, which raises the question, how does mail get into the system without stamps, without postmarks, without even fingerprints? Some experts today think Colin was simply mistaken, that he didn't notice in the rush of sorting. Others believe the sender must have had inside access to the mail. But at the time, for Ravensbrook residents, it felt almost supernatural. Tricky teats. One letter in particular stands out. It was sent to Margaret Ellis, a young mother of 2, who lived on Fen Street. She described it years later in a radio interview. The letter read, "The earth took one, but the water took another. Ravensbrook will never be clean. Ask the widow what she buried." The phrasing struck everyone who heard it as deeply unsettling. the earth, the water. Who was the widow? Margaret kept the letter hidden for months, too afraid to show her husband. She said she often woke at night, convinced she heard someone outside, footsteps crunching the gravel, a shadow at the window. By Christmas, nearly the entire town had been touched by the letters in one way or another. Some people swore they had seen a cloaked figure slipping between alleys at night. Others claimed the writer must be someone who grew up in Ravensbrook, because the letters contained details only locals would know. For example, one note delivered to the vicarage made reference to the child with the crooked doll at Ash Lane Bridge. And yes, there had been a girl 50 years earlier often seen playing by the bridge with a doll whose head was tilted at a strange angle. She disappeared in 1928. Her name was never spoken aloud in town again. The most unnerving thing, nobody could prove the letters were wrong. Not a single one contained information that could be easily disproven. Instead, they alluded to half-remembered scandals, hushed-up tragedies, things that had lingered in gossip but never reached the law. Was Ravensbrook a town with skeletons in its closets, or was someone deliberately trying to fracture its trust? In January of 1980, Edith Halloway received her second letter. This one was longer and crueler. It said, "You watched the smoke rise, Edith. You heard him call and you said nothing. His blood is on your hands." She fainted when she read it. Neighbors said she refused to leave her house after that curtains always drawn. And yet more letters followed, not daily, but sporadically, like a reminder that whoever wrote them was still out there, still watching. One more disturbing clue emerged in March when a local boy swore he found scraps of paper near the old mine entrance. They were smeared with red ink, words half visible. Never forgiven, always remembered. Police searched the mine but found nothing. The boy's father claimed he made the whole thing up for attention. Still, people in Ravensbrook whispered that maybe the writer had been working from underground hiding in the ruins of the mine itself. Ravensbrook was no longer quiet. People locked their doors at dusk. The pub emptied earlier each night. Even children who usually ran wild along the fields were kept home under the watchful eyes of their parents. Because if there was one thing everyone understood by now, it was this: the letters weren't just taunts, they were accusations, and sooner or later one of them would name names. By spring of 1980, Ravensbrook had gone from quiet suspicion to something close to paranoia. Whole conversations died the moment a stranger walked into the room. Neighbors who once shared tea in each other's kitchens now crossed the street to avoid eye contact. And the letters, those blood-red slips of paper, kept showing up. Always unmarked, always written in that same shaking hand. The local police, already stretched thin, tried to treat it as a prank. Officially, they told residents that no criminal activity has been confirmed. But off the record, officers admitted they were spooked. One constable even swore he found a letter stuffed under his windshield wiper while patrolling Fenn Street. It said, "Your badge won't protect you. You buried him too." The constable never spoke of it again. Ich tieg ausschietig. Let's pause here for one eerie historical detail that complicates things. In 1931, Ravensbrook hosted an inquest into the drowning of a young man named Samuel Cross. He was found face down in the marsh, his hands tied with rope. Officially, it was ruled an accident because the coroner claimed the rope was old and weakened, but locals never believed that. To them, Samuel's death was foul play, and the guilty party had walked free. So when the blood letters began hinting at the water and the drowned, some residents whispered that Samuel's ghost was speaking through them. Others thought it was someone from Samuel's family finally seeking revenge. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those connections are legitimate or just paranoia feeding on coincidence. one of the strangest incidents came that April. The town postmaster, Colin Whitby, the same man who first noticed the unstamped envelopes, disappeared for 3 days. His wife claimed he had gone to visit his brother in Manchester, but neighbours whispered they saw him wandering along the disused railway tracks at night, muttering to himself. When Colin finally returned, he looked hollow eyes, bloodshot clothes, damp as if he'd been caught in a storm. He never explained where he'd been, but a week later his wife received her own letter. It read, "You married into silence. His hands are never clean." That was the moment people began suspecting each other openly. The school children of Ravensbrook naturally were both terrified and fascinated. Several of them began daring one another to sneak into abandoned places mentioned in the letters. One group went down into the basement of the old vicarage. They found nothing but cobwebs and mice, but they swore they heard whispers echoing in the stone walls. Another group ventured to the edge of the marsh where Samuel Cross had drowned. They claimed to see scraps of paper floating on the water ink, bleeding into the reeds. Were these just childhood exaggerations? Probably. But the fear in Ravensbrook had grown so sharp that every shadow, every creak of wood felt like part of the mystery. One detail that still baffles researchers today involves the handwriting. Forensic specialists later confirmed that while the blood letters were all written in the same general style, thin, spidery script, subtle variations suggested multiple authors. Some letters bore looping dramatic strokes, others were tighter, almost cramped. So which was it? One unhinged writer carefully altering their hand, or multiple conspirators all working together to torment the town? Investigators are still debating that point. Some even suggest the blood letters were passed among different households, each person anonymously contributing their own accusations, using the letters as a twisted kind of confessional. If that's true, Ravensbrook wasn't just haunted by a single ghost writer. It was haunted by itself. The most chilling letter of the spring was received by Margaret Ellis, again the same woman who'd gotten the note about the widow. This one said, "Do not look at the window tonight. Do not draw the curtain. I am there." Her husband found her on the floor the next morning, clutching the letter eyes, swollen from crying. He swore she had not slept at all, convinced someone had been watching their home all night. And here's the unusual part. When he stepped outside at dawn, he found muddy footprints beneath their window, large ones, too large for any child. Odysseadi titug. As the months dragged on, the atmosphere in Ravensbrook grew unbearable. Families began leaving, selling their homes for half their worth. By July, almost a dozen houses stood empty, their curtains drawn gardens left to rot. And yet letters still appeared in those empty mailboxes, delivered to no one, piling up in silence. That's when the press finally arrived. Reporters from London drove in with their cameras, their notepads, their curiosity. They called Ravensbrook the town of blood letters. They interviewed townsfolk on their doorsteps, poking microphones into trembling hands. Some residents were furious, claiming outsiders had no business stirring things up. Others were relieved, hoping maybe national attention would end the nightmare. But of course the media only made things worse. One tabloid ran a headline, "Killer's Confession, Delivered in Blood." Another speculated the town was part of a satanic ritual ring. The truth was less sensational but far stranger. Because just as the reporters arrived, the letters changed. They stopped accusing the town as a whole and started naming names. The first was addressed to the Cooper family. It said, "The mine remembers. You left him there to choke. Don't pretend you didn't hear him calling. The Coopers had a grandfather who died during the 1922 mine accident. People wondered, was the letter accusing them of ignoring his cries for help, or of something darker sabotage? A week later, the vicar himself received one. Your sermons mean nothing. The blood is under your floorboards. Police actually tore up the church floor after that, searching for evidence. They found nothing. Still the whispers spread. Ravensbrook wasn't just afraid anymore. It was unraveling. Neighbors eyed one another across fences with open suspicion. Old friendships collapsed under the weight of half-spoken accusations, and all the while those envelopes kept sliding into mail slots, into coat pockets, even tucked into books on the library shelves. By late summer, the town had become a stage. The letters weren't just messages anymore, they were threats, a performance meant to force Ravensbrook's darkest history into the light. And as we'll see next, it worked. By autumn of 1980, Ravensbrook was no longer a village of quiet routines. It was a crucible burning away civility until only suspicion and dread remained. The letters had stopped being eerie curiosities tucked into mail slots. Now they were weapons targeting households one by one. Each message pulled some half-forgotten wound into the open, some long-buried shame, and pinned it to the front of a neighbor's door. And with each accusation, the air grew heavier. People swore they could hear whispers in the streets at night, like voices carried on the mist, repeating fragments of the letters themselves. One strange historical detail seemed to fuel the fire. In 1894, Ravensbrook had been the site of a scandal involving the disappearance of a schoolteacher named Clara Venning. Official records claimed she eloped with a travelling salesman, but parish records hinted at something darker. Multiple witnesses reported seeing her near the marsh at dusk on the night she vanished in the same place where Samuel Cross was later found drowned. So when a new letter appeared in September reading, "You lost Clara by the reeds. You lied about her running," residents didn't just see it as a random torment. They saw it as proof that Ravensbrook was being haunted by every sin it had tried to bury. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the author of the letters had access to rare archival material or whether they were simply weaving folklore into fiction. Either way, the effect was the same. Each letter dragged history screaming into the present. The next escalation came when children began receiving them. Little white envelopes tucked into their school bags, sometimes even slipped between the pages of their homework. One girl, 9-year-old Sophie Whitman, opened hers at the dinner table. Inside was a single sentence written in that trembling hand: "Your brother will be the next to drown." Her mother fainted on the spot. This was the turning point. Up until then, some had clung to the idea that the blood letters were a macabre prank, the work of some bitter shut-in or unstable relative of Samuel Cross. But once the children were targeted, the whispers turned into open fury. The townsfolk began patrolling their own streets at night. Men with lanterns walked in pairs, listening for movement, checking doorways, waiting for a glimpse of whoever was slipping the envelopes around. But they never caught anyone. Not once. Instead, the night patrols reported stranger things, footsteps crunching in the gravel behind them, only to turn and find nothing. Flickers of movement in the hedgerows. Even voices, faint and broken, muttering names they swore belonged to villagers dead for decades. By this point, the press coverage had become feverish. One London paper declared Ravensbrook the cursed town. Another claimed the letters were the work of a cult reenacting old witch trials. And then there were the academics, folklorists, who argued the blood letters were a form of communal haunting, the town's own repressed history bleeding into the present through anonymous writings. Investigators are still debating whether that explanation is psychology or just superstition dressed up in academic terms. The strangest single incident of that autumn happened to a farmer named Alfred Pritchard. Alfred was one of the loudest critics of the letters, dismissing them publicly as hysteria. But one night, after locking up his barn, he returned to his house to find every window in the front of his home covered in letters, dozens of them pasted to the glass with some sticky brown substance. Neighbors swore they smelled iron in the air that night, sharp and metallic. Alfred insisted it was just paint, maybe glue, but the rumor spread that it was blood, fresh and warm. For weeks afterward, Alfred kept his curtains drawn and stopped attending Sunday service. Some said he looked like a man who had seen a ghost and wasn't ready to admit it. Odd, it says. Another unusual detail, the handwriting once again shifted. Around October, the letters began arriving in block capitals, as though someone new had joined the game, or the original author was deliberately changing style to mislead investigators. A few letters even contained multiple hands on the same page, one scrawled over the other, as if in a dialogue. One read, "I was there," scrawled across, "No, you were not. Stop lying." The effect was chilling, like watching an argument erupt from beyond the grave. By November, the town was fracturing. Families accused one another openly in the market square. One man was punched in the face after a neighbor swore his handwriting looked just like the letters. Police were overwhelmed. The few officers still stationed there begged superiors for reinforcements. None came. Ravensbrook was left to fend for itself. And then, as suddenly as it began, the letters stopped. No one received a message for nearly 6 weeks. The winter passed in a strange, tense silence. The press declared the mystery over. Locals began to hope just a little that it had burned itself out. But hope in Ravensbrook was always fragile. Because on New Year's Day of 1981, a single envelope appeared pinned to the church door with a rusted nail. No address, no greeting, just 3 words: "Blood runs again." That letter wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. Winter in Ravensbrook had always been bleak, but the turn of 1981 carved something new into its bones. The mist was thicker than usual that January, curling over the cobblestones like a shroud. People whispered that the air itself smelled different, saltier, sharper, as though the sea was pushing its way inland to watch what was happening. The New Year's letter nailed to the church door with that rusted iron spike had shaken even the most skeptical. It wasn't just the message, though. Those 3 words, "Blood runs again," were damning enough. It was the fact that the letter had appeared in plain sight, affixed to the very center of the village. Whoever left it hadn't cared about secrecy anymore. They wanted to be seen. A historical echo surfaced almost immediately. In 1722, during a period of witchcraft hysteria in the region, the parish priest of Ravensbrook had nailed confessions forced from accused women onto the church door for public shame. Some older villagers remembered those stories and said aloud for the first time that the blood letters were not just about revenge, but about reenactment, that someone was deliberately dragging Ravensbrook back into its cruelest chapters. And this time, the letters didn't return to the usual rhythm of whispers and hints. They escalated. Over the first week of January, the mayor of Ravensbrook, Harold Dunning, found his office filled with dozens of envelopes stuffed into drawers, cupboards, even the clock tower mechanism. Some were blank, some contained only fragments of text. But one message stood out, smeared in something red across the back of a child's drawing. "You wear the mask of leader, but your hands pushed Samuel under." It was absurd on its face. Mayor Dunning hadn't even been in office during Samuel Cross's drowning, but the villagers seized on it. If the mayor was guilty, even symbolically, then maybe the entire leadership of Ravensbrook was corrupt, complicit, rotten at the root. Dunning stopped appearing in public after that. His wife claimed he had taken ill, though rumours spread quickly that he was drinking himself senseless in his study. Meanwhile, the letters began to take on a cruelly personal focus. Families found theirs stuffed not just through mail slots, but under pillows, between folded laundry, even inside loaves of bread delivered by the local bakery. One chilling example came from the Quinn household, where a loaf cracked open at breakfast revealed a note curled within the soft centre, "You will choke next." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Whoever was writing these had a talent for weaving terror into the ordinary fabric of life. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this level of infiltration suggests multiple culprits, an organized effort, or a single individual with an almost supernatural ability to move unseen. The strangest incident of that month belonged to Edith Lowe, the village librarian. She claimed she was alone one evening closing up when she heard the rustle of paper upstairs. Following the sound, she found the entire genealogy section, dismantled books pulled off shelves scattered across the floor pages marked with blood-red fingerprints, and there placed neatly atop the pile a fresh envelope. It read, "Your books hold the truth, Edith. Stop hiding it. No one ever saw who entered or exited the library that night." The doors had been locked, the windows shut tight. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Edith never returned to her post. By late January, people began leaving Ravensbrook in small, desperate waves. Families packed what they could and vanished into the night, hoping distance would sever the curse. But even that hope was crushed. One family, the Morrows, fled to the next county, only to find an envelope waiting on their new doorstep. The note inside read, "Ravensbrook follows." The village began to feel like a trap. Leaving didn't free you. It marked you. The most frightening change came in the way the letters began to mimic voices. Witnesses swore that when they read them aloud they could hear echoes like faint whispers matching the handwriting's message. A child described hearing the words repeat themselves in his sister's voice, even though she hadn't spoken. Scholars of folklore would later argue this was mass hysteria, an auditory hallucination born of collective fear. Others insisted it was something else entirely, that the letters themselves were vessels carrying voices not of the living, but of those Ravensbrook had buried. The academic debate has never been settled. By February, the paranoia was unbearable. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Doors were barred from the inside. The village square, once the heart of Ravensbrook, lay empty, except for the crows that perched on the church spire, staring down like black judges. And then came the moment that truly broke the village. On the 14th of February, Valentine's Day, a letter was discovered pinned to the notice board outside the grocer's. It was written in a child's uneven scrawl, not the shaky adult hand of before. And it said, "I am not dead, I am still here. You buried me, but I walk." Signed, Samuel Cross. The effect was immediate and devastating. If the letters were pretending to be Samuel's voice, it meant Ravensbrook wasn't just being accused, it was being haunted. But if the letters truly came from him, if somehow Samuel had survived or his spirit lingered, then nothing in Ravensbrook could be trusted. Not history, not memory, not even the grave. From that night onward, no one slept easy. The blood letters weren't just dredging up guilt anymore. They were rewriting the past. By the spring of 1981, Ravensbrook was hollowed out. The cobbled lanes, once bustling with children chasing dogs and women hauling baskets from the grocer, now carried only silence, broken by the clatter of shutters nailed shut. The smell of salt water lingered in the air, mixed with the faint smoke of hearths burning day and night, villagers believing that fire would keep the letters away. It did not. The first week of March, a chilling discovery rocked the already splintering community. A fisherman named Alden Price out before dawn found something snagged in his nets. At first he thought it was seaweed, dark and heavy, but when he pulled it aboard he found dozens of letters, envelopes sealed tight, waterlogged but still legible. They bobbed together like a cluster bound by twine. Each bore the same return name, scrawled in shaky hand, Samuel Cross. Inside the letters were strange. Some contained only one word, "Murderer Father You." Others had full sentences written in circles, as if the words refused to form straight lines. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the handwriting. It was the paper. Each envelope had been folded from pages torn from the parish's death records. The fisherman delivered them to the constable's office. By midday, nearly the entire village knew. For the first time, the theory of a single culprit faltered. How could anyone have placed those letters beneath the sea? And why tie them together waiting for the tide to carry them back? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the fisherman's find was staged to terrorize the town or whether Ravensbrook itself had become complicit, spitting up its own secrets from the depths. Meanwhile, suspicion turned inward. Families began accusing one another of hiding the truth. Old grudges resurfaced like rot under floorboards. The Quinns accused the Lowes of covering up the drowning. The Lowes in turn swore the Dunnings had rewritten parish records. Arguments erupted in the streets, sometimes violent. The oddest incident involved Mrs. Thatcher, a widowed seamstress. She stormed into the tavern one night, clutching a letter in both hands, shouting that it had been written by her dead husband. The note read, "It wasn't Samuel, it was me. Look deeper, Sarah." She swore she recognized his handwriting, his phrasing, even the crooked way he dotted his I's. But her husband had been buried for nearly a decade. Had the letters stolen his voice too, or was someone deliberately mimicking the familiar patterns of the dead to break her? Scholars today describe this as a classic example of handwriting mimicry meant to destabilize survivors. Yet locals still insist no living hand could have reproduced her husband's quirks so precisely. Adorchi, and then the children of Ravensbrook began to dream. By late March, parents reported their sons and daughters waking in the night screaming Samuel's name. They described a boy standing at the foot of their beds, dripping wet, his lips moving but no sound emerging. By morning, each child claimed to have received a message. One girl swore Samuel told her, "Don't open the cellar." Another boy whispered, "It was the sister, not me." The authorities dismissed it as nightmares fueled by overheard gossip. But the letters began to reflect those very words days later, arriving in homes across the village, echoing the children's reports exactly. No one could explain how the writer knew. The most unsettling moment of spring came during Easter Mass. The church was half empty, but those who attended recalled the same sequence of events. Halfway through the hymn, a gust of wind forced open the doors. Papers swirled inside like a storm, dozens of them fluttering down the nave. When parishioners bent to collect them, they found each sheet bore the same sentence over and over. "You sing above ground, but your sin is buried below." All signed once again, Samuel Cross. The priest tried to burn them on the altar, but the papers refused to ignite. Instead, they curled, darkened, and then collapsed into ash without flame. The congregation fled in silence. To this day, no one can explain how the pages entered the church. Some historians argue the event was exaggerated through rumour. Others insist it marked the turning point, the moment Ravensbrook truly believed it was cursed. After Easter, more families fled. But the remaining villagers noticed something sinister. The fewer people left, the more targeted the letters became. Entire households received nothing for weeks, while one unlucky home would be bombarded, dozens of envelopes shoved through cracks tied to doors, even carved into tree trunks outside. The Turner family bore the brunt of this wave. Their youngest daughter Emily vanished for 3 days that April. When she returned, she carried no memory of where she'd been. But folded inside her pocket was a letter. They let me out for a little while. I am not finished. SC, the handwriting was not hers. And by May, Ravensbrook had begun to fracture completely. Some residents spoke openly of abandoning the village forever, letting the crows and the sea reclaim it. Others clung to tradition, swearing that leaving would only carry the curse outward. The blood letters had done more than terrify. They had divided the very idea of community. Yet for all the horror, one strange fact remained constant. The letters were always written in the same ink-iron gall, the kind commonly used in the 18th century. By 1981, this ink hadn't been produced locally for generations. Investigators are still debating whether this detail was proof of an elaborate forgery or something impossible, letters truly written in another time, bleeding forward into the present. And as the spring waned into summer, the villagers waited for what they dreaded most, the next escalation. Because in Ravensbrook, the letters never receded, they only grew bolder. By the summer of 1981, Ravensbrook was not just haunted, it was cornered. The letters no longer felt random, no longer scattered with vague accusations or eerie whispers. They had taken on a deliberate rhythm, escalating as if someone or something were following a script. It began with the town square. On a damp morning in June, shopkeeper Harold Kent arrived to open his grocer's store. What he found stopped him cold. Every surface of the square benches, fountain lampposts had been plastered with letters. Hundreds of them affixed with tar-like resin that smelled of rot. Villagers gathered, pulling at the sheets, gagging at the stench. Each one carried the same phrase in the same shaky hand: "One of you killed me. One of you buried me." By noon, the wind had torn the papers into shreds, scattering them through the lanes like grotesque confetti. Children chased them, laughing, until parents dragged them inside, fearful of what invisible stain the words might carry. Investigators and historians still debate whether such a mass posting could have been done by a single culprit overnight. Some argue the entire village must have been complicit, unknowingly, sleepwalking, compelled by the same hidden hand. In the weeks that followed, the letters seemed to know more than they should. A letter appeared nailed to the schoolhouse door: "Stop teaching them lies. The truth is buried with the others." Days later, during renovations, workers found bones beneath the floorboards, animal remains mostly, but one skull too small to belong to livestock. The discovery was hushed, filed away under historical debris. But to villagers, the timing was too precise to ignore. Another time, Constable Davies received an envelope delivered directly to his office. Inside was a map of Ravensbrook, crudely drawn. A red X marked the constable's own home. Beneath it, a single line: "You eat dinner above my grave." That night, he and his family left town without a word, abandoning their houseplates still on the table. July brought heat, and with it, another wave of dread. The letters shifted tone, growing darker, sharper. They were no longer accusations, they were instructions. One letter told the miller to stop drawing water from the well. Another told a farmer to slaughter his ox before it tramples the truth. Most were ignored, written off as madness, but when the miller continued using the well, his eldest son collapsed foaming at the mouth. The coroner called it food poisoning, but the villagers whispered the word curse. The ox left alive broke its tether a week later and crushed the farmer's youngest beneath its hooves. After that, no one ignored the letters again. The strangest incident occurred during the annual midsummer gathering. Only a fraction of Ravensbrook turned up that year, the mood funereal rather than festive. They gathered around the bonfire, attempting to sing the old songs when the flames abruptly hissed. From inside, the fire papers began to emerge, singed but whole, carried upward by the heat. Children screamed, clutching at their parents' arms as the letters drifted into their laps. The words were blackened edges, glowing but still legible. You burn to forget me, but you burn with me. The bonfire collapsed, scattering sparks across the crowd. No one was injured, but the festival ended that night, never to be revived again. To this day, folklorists cannot explain how letters could have survived the fire long enough to appear in mid-air. Some call it sleight of hand, an elaborate prank. Others suggest the words themselves had become part of the village's very air, impossible to banish. By late summer, Ravensbrook's isolation deepened. Word had spread to neighbouring towns, and with it came journalists, academics, even tourists hoping to glimpse the cursed letters. A few stayed overnight in the village inn, only to flee before dawn, shaken by knocks at their doors and whispers under their windows. One journalist, Anna Trenton, documented her stay. She recorded receiving a letter beneath her pillow, despite locking her door and window before bed. It read, "Your ink cannot save you. Only blood writes truth." Her article ran weeks later in a London tabloid calling Ravensbrook a place where guilt breathes. She never returned. The influx of outsiders only fueled resentment. Villagers accused each other of fabricating the letters for profit. Old friendships crumbled. People no longer shared meals, no longer lent tools, no longer trusted anyone but their own blood, and even then, trust was fragile. And yet, amid the fear, a curious detail emerged. Historians reviewing the letters noticed that each bore a faint watermark, a raven in mid-flight. This was traced back to a defunct paper mill, one that had closed nearly 70 years prior. No new stock of such paper existed in the region. Investigators are still debating whether someone had hoarded the paper for decades, waiting for the right moment, or whether the letters were genuinely older than they appeared, drifting forward through time. The unanswered question remained, if they were old, why did they reference new events? Why did they mirror the dreams of children, the accidents, the unearthing of bones? By August, villagers began to vanish. Some families packed and left quietly. Others were simply gone one morning, their doors hanging open, plates still on the table. But most chilling of all were the disappearances without departure. Residents seen in the tavern one night, never glimpsed again. And wherever someone vanished, a letter remained. Always folded, always signed. One read, "I only take those who know," and now they are silent. The town's historian, Margaret Vale, made the boldest attempt to stop the madness. She began cataloguing every letter, preserving them in sealed boxes. Her goal was to create a record to prove the phenomenon was real, not just rumor, not just hysteria, but 3 nights after sealing the final box, she found a letter on her desk, placed neatly atop her locked diary. "You think you are writing history, but I am writing you." She left Ravensbrook the next morning. The boxes vanished with her. By the time the summer waned, Ravensbrook was a shell. Houses, shuttered shops, abandoned the church bell silent. Those who remained lived behind locked doors, whispering prayers to an empty sky. Because if the letters had started with accusation and moved into instruction, then now they felt like something worse. A countdown, each one shorter, sharper, each one pointing toward a truth buried deeper than anyone dared to dig. And through it all, the name remained the same. Samuel Cross. The boy who vanished, the boy who accused, the boy who would not rest. Autumn crept into Ravensbrook with a greyness that seemed to settle into the bones. Leaves rotted on the cobblestones, the river slowed to a sluggish crawl, and every morning a damp fog hung over the village, muffling sound, hiding shapes. But what unsettled people most wasn't the weather, it was the letters. They were shrinking. What had once been sprawling paragraphs now appeared as single lines, single words scrawled in that familiar slanted hand. Some were as brief as a single name. Others were fragments of sentences cut off like breaths in the throat. On the side of the tavern, someone or something had left one word painted in thick black strokes. Soon. That was it. No signature, no context, just soon. To the villagers it felt less like a message and more like a clock winding down. One strange incident stands out from October 3rd, 1981. Several children were walking home from school when they discovered a letter pinned to the trunk of the old ash tree at the crossroads. This tree had been the site of countless childhood games, tag, hide-and-seek, climbing contests, but on that afternoon no one wanted to touch it. The letter read, "Play is over, he waits beneath the roots." 2 days later, the tree split in half during a storm, revealing a hollow at its base. Inside was a bundle of rags, rotted almost beyond recognition. Mixed in were fragments of bones, small enough that even hardened policemen turned pale. Investigators are still debating whether those remains were human. Some claimed the fragments belonged to a goat discarded long ago. Others swore the proportions were unmistakably childlike. Either way, the discovery was enough to shatter whatever illusion of safety remained. Children were kept inside. The laughter that had once drifted through the lanes of Ravensbrook went silent. The paranoia turned neighbors into enemies. One woman, Ruth Henley, woke to find the words "murderer" scrawled across her door in soot. Within days, she was shunned. Former friends crossed the street to avoid her, refusing to make eye contact. She protested, shouting in the square that she had nothing to do with Samuel Cross, that she hadn't even been born when the boy vanished. A week later, Ruth vanished. Her cottage stood locked, her belongings untouched. On her kitchen table lay a single letter, folded. "Once you spoke too loud. Now you are with me." By November, even outsiders began to avoid Ravensbrook. The journalists, the curious travellers, the ghost hunters, they had all retreated, muttering of nightmares, of scratches on their walls, of whispers at their windows. One scholar from Cambridge, Professor Lionel Farrow, stayed longer than most. He had a reputation for debunking myths, exposing frauds. In his notes, he dismissed the Ravensbrook letters as collective hysteria, amplified by clever forgery. But his final entry took a darker turn. The letters are not written with ink. Under magnification, the strokes appear fibrous, as if woven from something organic, possibly hair. It is not possible that this is coincidence. I feel watched, though the streets are empty. Professor Farrow never submitted his paper. His room at the inn was found vacant, bed unmade. The innkeeper swore he had seen him the night before, sitting at the desk, pen in hand. On the blotter lay a final sheet of paper. You tried to read me. Now I read you. A peculiar detail surfaced around this time. Some letters bore not just words, but faint stains, circular and brown like dried tea. Chemists who tested samples claimed it was not tea at all, but blood-thin, diluted old. Historians argue over whether the stains predated the modern letters, suggesting they might be remnants of something older, perhaps ritualistic. Others insist the samples were contaminated. Still, the idea that blood had been used as ink fed into the villagers' deepest fears that the letters were not just messages, but offerings. The countdown quickened as December approached. The letters now often contained numbers: 5 remain, 3 nights, 1 truth, but what they referred to no one knew. Some believed it was a death toll, others said it was counting down to a revelation. One man, Jacob Milston, believed he had cracked the code. He stormed into the church one evening, clutching a fistful of letters demanding the vicar listen. He claimed the numbers matched the dates of the boy Samuel's disappearance anniversaries, hidden in plain sight. Before he could explain further, he collapsed mid-sentence. His heart had stopped. In his hand, villagers later found a note no one admitted giving him. "You counted wrong?" By the first frost, Ravensbrook was barely functioning. The inn closed. The grocer sold only salt, flour, and candles. People stopped working the fields. The school closed after a teacher received a letter that read, "Stop teaching lies, or they will join me too." Even the church fell quiet. The vicar left without a sermon, leaving the keys on the altar. In his Bible, parishioners found a single letter tucked between the Psalms, "No prayer will silence me." And still, the name repeated, always the same, always at the end, always in that trembling hand, Samuel Cross. Investigators are still debating whether this name was chosen deliberately to torment the living, or whether the boy himself, wherever he had gone, was truly writing. Because if it was a hoax, it had gone too far. If it was madness, it had infected too many. And if it was Samuel, then the dead had learned to write. Winter hit Ravensbrook hard. Snow blanketed the crooked lanes, muffling the world into silence. Chimneys smoked less often, and families burned through their stores of wood, as if the cold itself were hunting them. But no matter how deep the drifts grew, the letters continued. Black ink against white snow, bold and merciless, as though someone or something wanted to make sure they were seen. One bitter morning, a letter appeared in the very heart of the village square. No one admitted placing it there. The parchment was half buried in the snow, yet perfectly dry. Its words read, "The thaw will show what you buried." That sentence alone kept the villagers awake for weeks. Some claimed it was a threat that graves would open. Others whispered it meant someone in Ravensbrook had hidden a crime beneath the earth. And as the winter deepened, so too did the dread. Torm Iaskasawi. A strange incident occurred on January 12, 1982. Children sledding down the slope by the old mill swore they saw something protruding from the frozen riverbank. When adults investigated, they found a small leather shoe lodged in the ice. Just beside it, half frozen into the water, was another letter. It read, "1 foot already gone, the rest will follow." When the shoe was thawed, it was found to belong to no living child in the village. Its design matched shoes made in the 1960s, the very decade when Samuel Cross vanished. Investigators are still debating whether the shoe was planted deliberately to stir panic, or whether the thaw had revealed something that had lain hidden all these years. The pattern of the letters began to shift in unsettling ways. They no longer appeared only in public places. They showed up inside locked houses, tucked into teapots, folded into pillowcases. One man discovered a letter inside his sealed bread loaf, baked deep within the crust. That note said simply, "You swallow me daily." It was as though the author, or whatever force was behind the letters, wanted to prove that nowhere was safe, that the boundary between private and public had dissolved. Neighbors turned on each other with vicious suspicion. Families tore up floorboards searching for hidden caches of letters. People stopped speaking freely in their homes. Every knock at the door sent shivers through Ravensbrook. One particularly grim night, the letters seemed to multiply overnight. Dozens appeared all across the village, on doors, fences, shutters and walls. Even the livestock were marked. Sheep in the pasture bore scraps tied to their horns, and one cow was found with a note knotted around its tail. The words were the same on each one. "You are already mine." The villagers panicked. Some tore the notes down, burning them in their fireplaces. Others nailed them to crosses and left them outside their houses, hoping fire and faith would be enough. But by dawn, new letters appeared to replace the ones burned. Some bore soot on their edges as though mocking the attempt. A strange historical fact emerged around this time. Archivists digging through county records discovered that Ravensbrook had faced something eerily similar before. In 1742, an entry in the parish journal mentioned unnatural writings appearing across the village. It described them as warnings writ in a hand unclaimed concerning a boy drowned. The records were sparse, but the handwriting of the journal entry bore an uncanny resemblance to the modern letters. Scholars still debate whether the resemblance is mere coincidence or proof that Ravensbrook has been reliving the same cycle for centuries. By February, the letters turned cruelly personal. Entire households began receiving notes addressed to them by name. Some were trivial, revealing harmless secrets: who had stolen apples from the grocer, who lied about debts. Others were darker. One family received a letter stating, "You did not tell your daughter the truth about her brother." The implication was enough to spark a violent argument. Within days, the family left Ravensbrook altogether, abandoning their cottage. When neighbours investigated, they found one final letter sitting on the mantelpiece. Running changes nothing. "I am already there." Fear had turned inward. Men carried rifles openly. Dogs were chained to doorways. Doors were bolted, even in daylight. And still the letters arrived. Some villagers swore they could hear the sound of scratching in the night, like quills dragging across parchment, faint but steady. One woman described it best in her diary. "It is not that the letters frighten me. It is that they know me. They write what I have not spoken. They answer thoughts I have not said aloud. This is no prankster. It is the village itself speaking back." Her words circulated quietly, copied and passed from hand to trembling hand. The countdown reappeared in February, colder and more exact than ever. A series of notes appeared in sequence: 7, 6, 5. Each was found at dawn, placed in the center of the square like an offering. People began keeping vigil there through the night, determined to catch whoever was delivering them. But the next number always appeared anyway, untouched, snow all around it, no footprints leading near. By the time the notes reached, panic reached fever pitch. The final number one was never found. Instead, on the morning, it was expected a single long letter stretched across the wall of the abandoned inn, written in enormous dripping strokes. The letters were never mine. They are yours. And beneath it, smeared faintly in red, the same name again, Samuel Cross. The morning the inn was found marked with Samuel Cross's name, Ravensbrook ceased pretending it was only fear they were living with. This was something else, something older, something coiled inside their marrow like a sickness they'd inherited but never named. The villagers gathered outside the inn, staring up at the sprawling words that covered its front like a curse. No one dared step closer at first. The writing glistened as though wet, though no one could say what the substance was. Some swore it smelled faintly of iron. Others said it smelled of river water and mildew, as though it had been dredged from the earth itself. Whatever it was, the message froze them in place. The letters were never mine. They are yours. Those words suggested ownership, complicity. If the letters belonged to Ravensbrook, then every fearful whisper, every hidden truth was part of the thing tormenting them. An unusual detail turned panic into hysteria. When brave souls finally entered the inn, they found the interior covered in papers, hundreds of them each with a different hand, different ink, different age. Some were recent, still smelling of smoke from hearth fires. Others were brittle, yellowed with centuries. Every note bore a villager's confession, stolen grain, lies told to lovers, names of children born in secret, and among them, too many to count, were accusations neighbours turning on neighbours, blaming them for old disappearances, for sicknesses, for Samuel Cross himself. It seemed Ravensbrook had always been writing these letters, or a debate ignited immediately. Were these real confessions, or had someone forged them? Investigators and historians remain divided to this day. Some argue the papers had been gathered over generations, a twisted archive of the village's collective sins. Others insist the handwriting, shifting from page to page, suggested no single author, but many. Perhaps everyone had written one without realizing it. But the most chilling theory was this: Ravensbrook itself had been writing all along. The land, the air, the soil they had become, the ink. The inn became a fortress of whispers. People dared not burn the papers, afraid it would release something worse, yet leaving them intact made every villager suspect. One child pointed to a letter pinned above the fireplace and shouted, "That's Mama's handwriting." The mother denied it, but the resemblance was undeniable. Another man recognized his own words in a note describing a crime he'd never confessed. The handwriting was his, the memory was not. That night, 3 families abandoned Ravensbrook. They did not even pack belongings. They walked into the snow and never came back. But the letters did not stop. They began appearing on people's bodies, scraps tucked into boots under collars inside gloves. One woman fainted when she pulled a note from her sleeve that read, "You sleep with blood on your hands." And when she turned her palm upward, there was red ink smudged across her skin. The most infamous case was a man named Lionel Kerr, who found a letter inside his coat pocket while walking home from the tavern. It read, "You took him to the river." By morning, Lionel had disappeared. His boots were later found on the frozen banks of the river. One note stuffed inside, "Return what you owe." Panti Kai, a historical fact, surfaced then that rattled scholars even further. In 1891, another villager named Kerr had vanished without explanation. His family line had dwindled ever since. The connection was too precise for coincidence, but too faint to form a complete answer. Investigators are still debating whether the letters choose their victims based on bloodlines, carrying out some ancient curse against families that stretched too deep into Ravensbrook's soil. The villagers who stayed grew desperate. They formed nightly patrols, patrolling the square with lanterns and rifles. They sealed windows, hammered crosses into door frames, even carried salt in their pockets. but the letters always arrived anyway. Some were found clinging to rafters inside barns, others pressed into snow with no footprints around them, as if the sky itself had dropped them. A cruel twist emerged. The letters began predicting events before they happened. One evening a boy delivered a note left on the church doorstep. It read, "A scream will cut the night in half." And hours later, as the patrol circled the square, a scream did rise. A woman's voice split open by terror. When they rushed to her cottage, they found her staring at a note pinned to her wall. It said, "You screamed on time." The countdown resumed again, but this time it started not from numbers, but from names. Each night a new letter appeared bearing the name of a villager. The first was Eleanor, the next Martin, the next Clara. Each named person vanished within days. Some in the night, some in broad daylight. No signs of struggle, no footprints in the snow. Just gone. By the time the fourth name appeared, Ravensbrook was in collapse. Families huddled in silence, waiting to see if their names would be written next. The letters had grown bold enough to declare their own rules. One note read, "You cannot leave, you cannot fight. You can only confess." And so confessions poured out. At the tavern, in the square, in locked kitchens. People sobbed secrets to one another, hoping that speaking them aloud might stop the letters. But it made no difference. The final name to appear in that sequence was the one they had all dreaded since the beginning, Samuel. But Samuel had been gone for 20 years. And still they waited, terrified of what it meant for him to be summoned again. When the name Samuel appeared on the front door of the abandoned parsonage, the entire village gathered as if compelled. They stood in the snow, their breath-clouding faces gaunt with exhaustion, staring at that single word written in the same dark, wet script as all the others. Samuel Cross. 20 years gone, swallowed by Ravensbrook's river, or so the story went. His disappearance had been the village's original wound, the one that never healed, and now his name was written as though he had never left at all. Some whispered that the letters were demanding his return, that Samuel was still alive, hidden somewhere beneath the weight of their guilt. Others muttered darker things. Samuel had never truly vanished. He had only changed, become something the village could no longer recognize. No one dared enter the parsonage, though the door hung open like a mouth. That night, a storm broke over Ravensbrook. The wind howled down chimneys and rattled shutters until villagers swore they heard Samuel's voice inside the gusts. "Confess it," whispered. "Confess or follow." A strange detail, later confirmed by several families, was that the snow carried words. Tiny black flecks appeared in drifts on windowsills, spelling single letters. By morning, entire sentences lay etched across the white fields. "He waits in the water." The villagers knew exactly which water. The Ravensbrook River, slow and dark, cutting through the town like a vein. By dawn, the bravest among them gathered at the riverbank. The ice had cracked in the night, leaving dark water gaping in jagged shapes. And floating just beneath the surface, barely visible, was a figure, a man's outline. At first they thought it was a body trapped beneath the current. But as the water shifted, the figure seemed to move against it. An arm bent at an angle, a hand pressed against the underside of the ice. One man swore he saw Samuel's face staring up at him, pale and open-eyed. Another claimed the figure was his own brother. A third, trembling, said it looked like no one at all, just a blank face with nothing behind it. Historians are still debating whether this was mass hysteria, a hallucination born of fear, or something far less explainable. The panic broke into chaos. Some fled, immediately abandoning Ravensbrook by force despite the letter's warning. Others stayed frozen in place, unable to move, staring at the ice as though Samuel himself might claw his way out. That evening, the letters returned stronger than ever. Dozens of them appeared nailed to doors, slipped under thresholds plastered against the inn's cracked windows. Each one bore a single line, but together they formed a litany. He was never gone. You are Samuel, every one of you. The meaning tore the village apart. If Samuel's disappearance had been the seed of their haunting, then perhaps the truth was that Samuel was not a boy at all, but an inheritance, a curse that chose its name in 1820 and would choose others in the centuries after. That theory holds weight even now. Records from outside Ravensbrook show the name Samuel Cross appearing in letters, newspapers, and testimonies long after the boy's supposed death. Each time, a different age, a different face, a different place. Investigators still argue, was Samuel a victim, or was he the mask the village wore to hide its own sins? The climax came when a bell rang out through the storm on the 10th night after Samuel's name appeared. It was the church bell, though no one was inside to ring it. Villagers stumbled into the square, half blinded by snow, and found a sight that none could forget. Pinned to the church door was a single massive letter, larger than all the rest, scrawled across several sheets of parchment stitched together. It read, "Samuel has confessed, have you?" And beneath it lay a pile of clothing. Old clothing weathered with age, a boy's coat frayed at the sleeves, a pair of boots too small for any of the men still living, a cap still damp, smelling of river water, Samuel's clothing, but no body. What followed was hysteria that fractured Ravensbrook forever. Some believed Samuel had been reborn among them, that one of their children had inherited him. Others swore the river had spat his belongings back, as proof they had lied for too long. 3 families dragged their children to the edge of the village that very night, insisting they would not raise Samuel's heir. They left into the storm, never to be seen again. Those who stayed endured a new kind of torment, whispers in their own voices, drifting out of hearth flames and cellar doors, confessions they had never spoken aloud, spoken back to them as though their own souls were betraying them. The letters had stopped appearing on paper. Now they were written into the air. Atik Hauki. One strange fact lingered after this collapse. In 1902, an excavation near the Ravensbrook River uncovered a chest buried deep in the soil. Inside were dozens of letters dating back centuries each, with different handwriting but all signed with the same name, Samuel. The find has been catalogued, studied, and debated endlessly. Who wrote them? Why bury them? Why did they begin resurfacing precisely when the town was at its weakest? Theories abound, but no consensus has ever been reached. By the end of that winter, Ravensbrook was half deserted. Empty houses stood like teeth missing from a smile. Those who stayed rarely spoke above whispers, as though sound itself could provoke another letter. And yet the inn still stands today, untouched, its windows sealed. Locals say the words on its facade never faded. If you pass by at dawn when the fog rolls heavy from the river, you can still see them shining faintly in the air. The letters were never mine. They are yours. And that is how Samuel Cross, the boy who vanished, became the boy who never left. The year Ravensbrook broke apart was recorded in ledgers, but the story afterward is mostly silence. No census kept, no church bells rung, just a scattering of diaries and scraps of testimony pieced together like bones of a body that never fits right. One of those scraps came from a woman named Margaret Whitlow, a schoolteacher, who swore she saw children tracing letters in the frost on their windows. The letters always spelled Samuel. She wrote, "They do not play, they do not laugh, they only write his name." As though the snow has replaced their voices. A strange detail about her account when her diary was uncovered. Decades later, half the words were missing. Entire pages were blank, as though the ink had been lifted by invisible fingers. Yet the name Samuel remained untouched, repeated again and again. This was when the blood letters first appeared. Unlike the earlier messages scrawled in soot, ash, or ink, these were written in a deep rust-colored fluid on the walls of barns, the undersides of staircases, even the insides of cupboards. Villagers whispered it was blood, though no one dared to test it. One man, Elias Rowan, swore the words pulsed like veins alive beneath the wood. He claimed to hear them beating in rhythm with his own heart until he nearly tore out his chest in panic. Historians still debate whether this was hallucination or whether Ravensbrook's decay had reached something more corporeal. The letters spoke plainly now. Your silence was your confession. Every lie was written in flesh. Samuel remembers. It was not only walls that bore the messages. By spring, livestock were found with letters carved into their hides, not clean cuts, but marks that seemed grown into the skin, as if the animals had been born that way. A cow stumbled into the square with return scarred across its flank. A horse collapsed by the well ribs, heaving the word "confess" raised like welts across its chest. People began to believe Ravensbrook itself was transforming every living thing within it, warped into script. The panic tipped into violence. Families turned on one another, accusing each other of harboring the original sin, the one that had swallowed Samuel Cross. Some claimed Samuel's parents had lied about his death, burying him alive. Others insisted Samuel had been sacrificed, drowned, to protect the town from something darker. One chilling fragment preserved in a court record from a neighboring parish reads, "We held him down. He was too loud. Too loud. No names were attached. No explanation followed." Still today, academics argue if this is evidence of Samuel's murder or another child entirely. The ambiguity is what keeps the story alive. But the most haunting moment of all came on Midsummer's night. The villagers, those few who still remained, woke to find their own names written across their homes, each one paired with Samuel's. Thomas, Samuel. Rebecca, Samuel. Elias, Samuel. It was as if the village itself had decided they were all versions of the same boy, all equally guilty, all equally marked. And in the square, nailed to the church door once more, was a final blood letter. Samuel was never one. He was all. Theories suggest this was the breaking point that finally drove the last inhabitants to abandon Ravensbrook. No records exist of burials or baptisms after that year. The place simply emptied, leaving only the letters behind. And when researchers revisited Ravensbrook in the 1960s, they found the walls still marked. The barns were collapsed, the church roof caved in, but the letters remained. Not faded, not washed away, crisp and sharp as if written yesterday. One academic noted a peculiar phenomenon when he tried to photograph them. The film came back blank except for the word Samuel filling the entire frame. Another swore he heard his own name whispered behind him, as he bent to copy the words into his notebook. Investigators and historians are still debating whether these events were products of mass hysteria-doctored accounts or something far stranger embedded in the soil of Ravensbrook itself. And yet the strangest discovery of all happened beneath the church floor. A hollow cavity bricked over centuries earlier contained not a coffin, but a bundle of parchments, letters, hundreds of them, each addressed to someone in the village, each ending the same way, yours in faith, Samuel. But the handwriting shifted from page to page, decade to decade. A boy's clumsy scrawl, a woman's elegant script, an old man's shaky hand, dozens of styles all carrying the same name. How can one boy write across centuries? How can an entire village bear the same confession? That is the unresolved question Ravensbrook leaves behind. To this day, travellers who pass near the ruins claim the ground itself bears letters in the weeds and stones spelling Samuel over and over. Children born nearby have been found tracing his name before they even learn to speak. A chilling superstition persists if you speak Samuel's name aloud. Within Ravensbrook's borders, the letters will begin to appear in your own handwriting the next morning. Some say they are warnings, others insist they are invitations. Either way, Samuel remains. The discovery of the hidden parchments beneath the church floor spread like wildfire among researchers and folklore enthusiasts. But what people rarely talk about are the strange side effects experienced by those who handled the letters. One archivist described waking in the middle of the night to find words etched into the condensation of her bedroom window. "Samuel thanks you." Another claimed his hands wouldn't stop trembling, as if trying to write against his will. He had to sleep with his fists clenched, yet still found pages filled with Samuel's name on his desk in the morning. A peculiar historical footnote comes from the 18th century, the parish records list a visiting bishop who reported a parish overtaken by writing. His notes describe parchment nailed to trees, letters woven into baskets, even fields ploughed in furrows that spelled Samuel's name. Though critics argue these accounts were exaggerated, they align eerily with the modern rediscovery of the blood letters. Here's the part that unsettles me most. Several of the recovered letters were not addressed to villagers at all, but to future readers. One letter reads, "You who are holding this know me. You know I was not drowned. You know I was not buried. You carry me, though your bones deny it." It's unsettling to imagine words written 3 centuries ago addressing anyone alive today. Investigators and scholars still debate whether this was a forgery or whether Ravensbrook's terror somehow foresaw its own rediscovery. And remember, each one ends with the same closing, yours in faith, Samuel. By the mid-1970s, the ruins had become a quiet pilgrimage site for thrill seekers, amateur ghost hunters, teenagers daring each other, even academics desperate for tenure-building papers, all walked among the shattered barns and ivy-covered stone walls. Some returned with stories of nothing but wind and silence. Others never returned at all. The most infamous case involved 2 siblings, Richard and Laura Gibbons, who travelled to Ravensbrook on a stormy night in 1978. Their abandoned car was found on the lane. The only evidence at the ruins were notebooks filled with lines of writing identical and endless, "We belong to Samuel." Their disappearance remains unsolved. That same decade, aerial photography revealed something even stranger. The layout of the ruins formed letters when viewed from above. The collapsed roofs, the streets, the fields all together spelling Samuel spread across the land like a giant brand. Some argue it was coincidence, others whisper that the village itself had been designed as a letter, its people just living within a sentence, too large to see until it was too late. A scholar put it bluntly, perhaps Ravensbrook was never a town, perhaps it was a page, and we were just reading it too slowly. Here's a detail that always gets buried in footnotes. In 1982, workers restoring a road near the ruins uncovered a chest. Inside were bones, small, delicate bones clearly belonging to a child. Wrapped around them was a fragment of parchment that read, "If I am bones, then you are words. If I am gone, then you must remain." The handwriting matched the Samuel letters, but carbon dating placed the ink decades older than the parchment itself, as though time itself disagreed on when the message had been written. Now this is where the mystery deepens beyond folklore. In the 1990s, a team of linguists noted that the letters contained phrases in languages that hadn't yet existed when Samuel allegedly disappeared, words borrowed from modern slang, fragments of speech that wouldn't appear for centuries. It's as though the blood letters weren't trapped in the past at all. They were writing forward, stretching across time like veins through the body of history. The unsettling theory that Samuel never vanished. He's still writing even now through anyone who encounters his name. And there's one last incident you need to hear. In 2003, a graduate student studying Ravensbrook collapsed in her dorm room. On her arms, written in what doctors swore was her own blood, were the words, "Samuel is yours now." She survived, but she refuses to speak to this day. Investigators and historians are still debating whether Ravensbrook is a product of hysteria, a fabrication born of fear and grief, or whether it represents a new category of haunting altogether. A haunting not of place, but of language itself, because every record, every testimony, every strange diary, every blood letter says the same thing. Samuel is still being written. And the question you need to ask yourself is this: if Samuel was never one boy, if Samuel was all, then what happens when his words find you? Word count 1 by teens. When you peel back the layers of Ravensbrook, the question that nags like a splinter under skin is simple. Who was Samuel? Really, villagers remembered him as a pale boy, one who rarely spoke, who scribbled furiously on scraps of bark and cloth when others played. A parish ledger from 1711 records a boy baptized Samuel Ainsworth, son of a miller. But here's the contradiction: he wasn't the only Samuel. The same year records list two other children named Samuel, born within weeks of each other. Yet later testimony always insists there was only one Samuel. Historians still debate whether memories collapsed into one figure, or whether something or someone merged those identities. The unusual detail: in some of the blood letters, the signature isn't Samuel at all. It's "we." I should be such. Here's where it gets stranger. In 1720, when famine gripped the countryside, Ravensbrook alone prospered. Their harvest was fuller, their livestock healthy, while neighbouring villages starved. Church records show neighbouring parishes accusing Ravensbrook of witchcraft, but no inquiry was ever launched. What fueled their fortune? When archaeologists examined soil samples around Ravensbrook in the 1970s, they found high concentrations of iron unnatural for farmland. A metallurgist compared it to blood-rich ground, suggesting centuries of organic seepage. That's the academic way of saying too much blood had been spilled here. Let's not forget Ravensbrook's disappearance remains the most debated mystery in English rural history. Some argue plague swept silently through, others suggest mass hysteria. But then there's the chilling theory Ravensbrook didn't vanish at all. it was rewritten. Eyewitness reports from neighbouring hamlets describe walking into Ravensbrook one week to buy grain, then returning days later to find only fields, houses, barns, wells, all erased. No rubble, no fire scars, just smooth earth, like words scrubbed clean from a page. Now I want to bring up something unsettling. In 2015, researchers digitizing old maps noticed a cartographer's margin note beside Ravensbrook's coordinates removed by revision. Not ruined, not destroyed, just revised. Imagine that. An entire village treated like an error in a draft. And then there's the sibling connection. One letter, perhaps the most disturbing of all, is written not by Samuel but to Samuel. The author calls themselves your sister, though no record shows Samuel had siblings. The handwriting is frantic, carved almost through the parchment. You are not alone. I see you. They are reading you through me. Please let me go. The academics are divided. Was this the hallucination of another villager, perhaps a young girl lost in fear? Or was Samuel not one boy at all, but a collective, a voice that absorbed his neighbours one by one until even his sister ceased to exist except as ink on skin? By the late 2000s, the Blood Letters of Ravensbrook became a favoured topic at paranormal conferences. Yet every investigator who tried to bring physical artifacts home reported misfortune. One curator suffered a stroke. A graduate student set fire to her thesis before vanishing. A priest invited to bless the letters died in his sleep, his hand clenched around a pen. Coincidence? Or Samuel reminding everyone that his words don't belong to shelves and glass cases, they belong to him. And here's a chilling callback. Remember the Gibbons siblings who vanished in 1978, leaving notebooks filled with, "We belong to Samuel"? Well, those notebooks have been re-examined. Tucked between pages, invisible under normal light, scholars found another script. Under UV light, faint words appear beneath the repetition. They read, "Turn the page, turn the page, turn the page." But the notebooks had no final page. They ended mid-sentence, as though the siblings themselves were meant to continue it. Theories abound. Some investigators argue Samuel wasn't a child at all, but a mask, a name for something far older, perhaps pre-Christian, inhabiting the land. Others believe he was a genuine boy whose grief and madness birthed a self-perpetuating legend. But here's where the debate cracks wide open. A fragment discovered in 2021 suggests otherwise. A small parchment tucked into the spine of a family Bible reads, "If you read me, you are Samuel. If you hear me, you are mine." In other words, Samuel isn't a boy or a ghost or even a memory. Samuel is a role, a name that passes on like contagion. So the question remains, how many Samuels have there been since the first letter bled onto the page? How many are there now? And more importantly, could you just by listening become the next? You've heard the name so many times tonight that maybe it's already starting to hum under your skin. Samuel, it has a rhythm to it, doesn't it? Like the kind of word that sticks. Not because it's beautiful, but because it refuses to let go, and that's the problem. Ravensbrook's story isn't about one child with ink-stained fingers. It's about the stickiness of his voice, the way his letters spread like a contagion. In 1993, a team of folklorists tried something daring. They gathered every known copy of the Ravensbrook letters, facsimiles, not originals, and read them aloud in sequence like a play. They wanted to test whether the rhythm of the words had carried a kind of ritualistic power. By the third evening, they stopped the project. 2 members reported hearing whispers when no one else was speaking. One swore she saw ink bleeding through her palms after closing the book. Another quit the field entirely, telling colleagues, "If you make Samuel speak, he makes you speak back." That account was quietly filed under unverified, but it lingers like a dare. Let's pull on another loose thread, the sound of Ravensbrook. Locals who lived within walking distance of where the village once stood claimed that on certain nights you could hear scratching, not animal scratching, pen on parchment, sometimes a voice humming a child's rhyme, half forgotten. Investigators planted sound recorders in the fields in 2008. What they captured was bizarre. Hours of static yes, but faint beneath a repeated phrase in archaic English, "Bind the ink, bind the blood, bind the name." Skeptics call it wind distortion. Believers call it Samuel still writing. And then there's the physical danger of the surviving pages. The ink itself has been tested, no unusual chemicals, just iron gall ink common for the time, but on some samples the iron concentration is alarmingly high, close to levels found in human hemoglobin. One historian bluntly remarked, "It's not impossible that Samuel wrote with blood mixed into ink." That suggestion alone fuels one of the most enduring debates. Was Ravensbrook's famine-defying prosperity in 1720 tied to sacrifice? Were villagers willingly or unwillingly bled to keep crops alive? Or is this yet another layer of myth invented centuries later to explain the inexplicable? No one agrees. And maybe that's Samuel's greatest trick, to keep us circling the same questions, never closing the loop. But let's rewind to that strange sister letter, the one that said, "You are not alone, I see you." Archivists reviewing the handwriting noted something uncanny. The strokes matched those of Samuel's own letters except for the pressure of the quill, as if the same hand wrote both voices, just pressing harder for one, softer for the other. So was the sister real, or was Samuel writing back to himself, creating his own chorus to make the "we feel more convincing"? That puzzle has divided experts for decades. Some argue the sister was a real girl swallowed by his mania. Others insist she was invented. But a tiny camp of scholars whispers the most disturbing thought of all: maybe Samuel himself was the invention and the sister was the only real one. She tried to resist, but was overwritten, smudged out of existence by her brother's ink. Critiques. And here's the kicker. In 2022, a private collector auctioned off a forgotten Ravensbrook page. It carried only 4 words written in jagged script: "Stop reading. Too late." The buyer anonymous. The page never seen again. Which brings us to tonight. You're still here following Samuel's trail. Maybe you're asking yourself, why does this feel like more than just a story? Why does it itch at the back of my mind like a word I can't shake? That's how Samuel works. He doesn't haunt houses. He doesn't rattle chains. He lodges himself in memory, and the more you speak him, the more real he becomes. Investigators and scholars still debate whether Ravensbrook was a plague village, a hoax, or a genuine occult erasure. But across every theory, one common warning persists. It's not Ravensbrook you should fear. It's not the famine or the vanishing or the empty maps. It's the voice that insists again and again, "Turn the page, turn the page." And every time you do, you've already given him what he wants. So, what happens when you reach the last page? We'll find out, because we're almost there. You've made it this far, and I have to say most people don't. By now, most turn away, shrug, and let Ravensbrook fade back into the fog. But not you. You stayed with me letter by letter, whisper by whisper, And now we're at the edge of the story, what some call its ending, though others insist it's just the start of another loop. In the archives of the Cambridge Folklore Society lies a box marked Raven B. The lid bears no accession number, no catalogue entry, just that faint black stamp. When opened, it reveals a diary, a slim, leather-bound book attributed to a man named Elias Crane, one of the last known schoolmasters of the Ravensbrook parish before the famine. Inside, his handwriting wavers with fatigue, but the final entries matter most. He writes about the children who vanished, about strange marks scrawled on the inside walls of the chapel, about voices that weren't prayers but still echoed like litany. And then in his final note, the most chilling line: Samuel is not writing anymore. Samuel is being written. That phrase is what divides scholars to this day. Was Elias Crane suggesting that Samuel had lost control of his own identity, consumed by some force larger than himself, or was it an admission that the villagers themselves, through repetition of his letters, were unconsciously feeding life into an imaginary child? Because here's the unnerving thing: even after Ravensbrook was abandoned, letters attributed to Samuel kept appearing. Found tucked into hollow trees or slipped into collections centuries later, their handwriting consistent with the originals. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this was forgery hysteria or something more unexplainable. And now let's tie together the strangest artifact, the blood-stained quill. Recovered in 1896 from the ruins of what might have been the schoolhouse, it bore dried residue along its shaft. Laboratory tests as recent as 2017 confirmed that the trace matter is indeed human blood, female, not male, from a genetic line untraceable in modern databases. The obvious conclusion: it belonged not to Samuel, but to the so-called sister. That changes everything. If the quill was hers, was she the real author of the counter letters, the comforting notes, the soft reassurances written in the margins? Was Samuel merely a projection, the violent half of her split psyche recorded in the same hand, but with a different force? Or, and here's the darker possibility, was Samuel the invention and the sister, the true originator, erased by history, but preserved in fragments of ink? Here's where it gets deeply uncomfortable. If you compare the handwriting samples side by side, Samuel's letters bear a distinct rightward slant, sharp and aggressive. The sister's voice, those calmer words, leans left, hesitant, almost whispering. A few forensic psychologists studying the samples suggested that these dual handwritings could exist in the same person, alternating states of mind, meaning Ravensbrook might not have been haunted by a boy at all. It might have been undone by a girl, her voice splitting into two, one part desperate to save the other, determined to destroy. But as always, no one agrees. Some refuse to entertain the notion, calling it pseudoscience. Others believe it explains everything. And a small group of occult historians claim we're asking the wrong question entirely. They insist Samuel or his sister was never human to begin with. Just a mask worn by something older, something that writes through people. And that's where we leave it. The Blood Letters of Ravensbrook remain unsolved. No graves, no bones, no birth records, just pages that keep turning up one by one in places they shouldn't be. A diary that ends with the suggestion that writing is not always an act of creation. It can also be possession. So what do we do with that? Well, maybe nothing. Maybe you turn off this video stretch, grab some water, and laugh at how eerie it all sounded. Or maybe you'll notice tomorrow when you jot down a grocery list or sign your name on a form that your handwriting looks a little unfamiliar, like someone's guiding your hand, like someone's whispering, bind the ink, bind the blood, bind the name. Sitirai. That's the final case file, that's Ravensbrook. The mystery has never been solved, but tonight you've carried it with me, and that makes you part of it now. Before we fade out completely, let's slow down. Take a breath with me, because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's written, it's the silence that follows. Picture Ravensbrook now, not as a cursed place, but as an empty field. Wind moving across grass, no houses, no voices, just the occasional bird overhead. Peaceful almost. But under that peace is the knowledge that hundreds of people once lived there and then simply didn't. And whether it was famine madness or something written into being, the lesson lingers. Stories have weight. They settle in the soil. They rise again when we speak them out loud. So as you drift towards sleep tonight, remember, Samuel isn't dangerous because he shouts. He's dangerous because he whispers over and over until you whisper back. Now soften your thoughts. Let the edges blur. Let the last image fade like an old photograph, yellowed and curling at the corners. And if you hear scratching tonight, don't worry. It's probably just the wind. Good night.